Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the helicopter window as the ancient peaks of central Japan spread beneath them like wrinkled flesh. The Kumano Kodo region stretched endlessly, shrouded in mist that seemed to writhe with unnatural life. Somewhere in those primordial forests lay their destination, a site sealed from the world for 70 years. 5 minutes out, the pilot announced, his voice crackling with static. Sarah glanced at her companions. Dr. Marcus Webb, archaeologist, reviewed satellite images with weathered concentration. Beside him, Yuki Tanaka, their local guide, stared at the mountains with an expression she couldn't read. Dr. James Morrison, geologist, seemed absorbed in his equipment readings. The locals call it Akumu no Ana, Yuki said suddenly. The nightmare hole. Webb looked up. Superstitious nonsense. The Imperial Army sealed these caves in 1945 for strategic reasons. Perhaps, Yuki replied carefully. My grandfather helped seal it. He never spoke of what they found, but he never slept well again. Sarah had heard whispers during her research. Local legends spoke of an ancient pit that predated civilization, a wound in the earth that bled shadows and whispered madness, academic folklore, but the Japanese military had classified the area and forbidden access for decades. 3 years of bureaucratic pressure had secured this expedition. Official reason: geological survey of unique mineral formations. Unofficial reason: the caves contained something that terrified the Imperial Army enough to dynamite the entrances. The helicopter descended toward a forest clearing. Sarah's stomach clenched, seeing concrete barriers and rusted warning signs. Even after 7 decades, the place felt abandoned beyond mere neglect. They landed with rotor wash, sending dead leaves spiraling like tiny tornadoes. As the engine wound down, oppressive silence settled, the kind that made you aware of your heartbeat. Jesus, Morrison muttered, it's like a graveyard. The nervous pilot, Sato, refused to shut down completely. I return in 3 days. You have emergency radio. Do not go deeper than your lights can reach. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Sato was lifting off, eager to escape. They watched the helicopter disappear, leaving them truly alone. The cave entrance lay uphill, marked by shattered concrete remains. Decades of weather had cracked the barrier, creating person-sized gaps. Faded Japanese warning signs surrounded the area like paper tombstones. Kiken, Shinyu Kinchi, Shi no Kiken. Yuki read aloud. Danger, no entry, risk of death. Webb scoffed. Standard overreach, probably unstable geology. But approaching the cave mouth, Sarah felt something wrong on a fundamental level. A subtle air current flowed from the darkness, carrying a smell that made her hindbrain scream warnings her conscious mind couldn't interpret. Morrison frowned at his instruments. That's odd. Magnetic anomalies that shouldn't be possible. Electromagnetic readings completely off the charts. Equipment malfunction? Sarah suggested hopefully. All devices showing impossible readings? Unlikely. Morrison's voice mixed excitement with unease. Whatever's down there affects matter's fundamental properties. They spent the afternoon setting up camp. As darkness fell, Sarah stared at the cave entrance. Even her headlamp couldn't penetrate beyond a few meters. It wasn't just dark, it actively devoured light, creating shadows that moved independently. That night, none slept well. Strange sounds echoed from the forest, not normal nocturnal chorus, but rhythmic scraping like enormous fingernails on stone. Flashlight investigations revealed only normal forest. Morning brought tracks around their camp, not animal prints, but deep gouges arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The marks spiraled inward toward the cave, as if something had circled them during the night. We should have brought more people, Morrison said quietly. Or fewer, Yuki replied, pale in morning light. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Whatever lay beneath the mountains, whatever had terrified the Imperial Army, they would find today. The rational part insisted it would be unusual geology or forgotten military installation. But staring into the cave's black maw, feeling wrongness radiating like heat from a furnace, she couldn't shake the feeling they were about to discover something that would change them forever. The nightmare was waiting. Chapter 2. They entered at dawn, when morning light contrasted starkly with absolute darkness within. Sarah led, her LED headlamp carving white light through oppressive blackness. The others followed single file, their lights creating a constellation that seemed pitifully small against vast emptiness. The tunnel descended sharply, carved from solid rock with precision that caught Webb's attention. This isn't natural formation, he said, running his hand along impossibly smooth walls. But not human engineering either. The tool marks are too perfect. Morrison's instruments went haywire. Every few steps, he recalibrated, muttering about impossible readings, electromagnetic signatures strengthening. Like there's a massive power source, but no electrical grid reaches this far. 20 minutes down, they encountered the first anomaly. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber 30 meters across, with 7 passages branching off. But the ceiling made them all stop and stare. Embedded above was a perfect spiral of what looked like obsidian, but obsidian that moved. The black material flowed like liquid while maintaining solid form, creating hypnotic patterns that drew the eye deeper into geometric complexity. "Don't look directly," Yuki warned, though his own gaze fixed upward. "My grandfather described this. He said it was like looking into a sleeping god's eye." Sarah forced herself to look away, but after images remained, burned, spirals within spirals, patterns suggesting meaning beyond comprehension. Closing her eyes, she still saw it moving, writhing like living tattoo. Webb photographed it, but reviewing his camera's LCD showed only blank stone. Impossible. The camera works fine, but that thing doesn't want recording. They chose the central passage, descending even steeper. These walls bore markings that weren't quite writing, weren't quite art. The symbols seemed to shift peripherally, rearranging into configurations that made Sarah's head ache. "How deep are we?" Morrison asked, after 10 more minutes. Sarah checked her altimeter. "Sea level, but we started at 1,500 meters elevation." "Instruments malfunctioning," Morrison said unconvincingly, staring at readings with growing alarm. "Unless fundamental physics constants differ down here." The tunnel leveled into what appeared to be a vast underground highway. The floor was perfectly smooth, worn by countless feet, but feet of what? Where patterns suggested millions of years of traffic, yet surrounding rock formations were far younger. Yuki first noticed they weren't alone. "Stop," he whispered, raising his hand. "Listen, absolute silence, only their breathing." Then, carried on impossible air currents, came movement sounds. Not footsteps exactly, but rhythmic scraping punctuated by what might be breathing, if breathing could sound like wind through graveyards. "Something's following us," Morrison said, voice tight with fear. Sarah turned her light back, but the beam died after meters, swallowed by pressing darkness. In that abbreviated illumination, she thought she saw movement shapes that shouldn't exist, geometries that hurt to perceive. "We keep moving forward," she decided. "Whatever's back there doesn't want us retreating." The passage opened into another chamber so vast their lights couldn't find walls or ceiling. Footstep echoes returned from impossible distances, creating movement chorus that made them seem surrounded by shadow armies. In the center, revealed by combined headlamp glow, stood a structure defying every architectural and physics law Sarah knew. It was simultaneously pyramid and spiral, tower and pit, solid matter existing in multiple dimensions. Looking directly caused vertigo with nausea, as if her brain processed visual information it wasn't equipped to handle. "Jesus Christ," Webb breathed. "What is that?" Morrison's equipment screamed, emitting warnings that echoed like electronic screams, readings off every scale. That structure's bending space-time around itself. Approaching the impossible architecture, Sarah heard something that chilled her blood. Voices. Human voices speaking unrecognized languages, calling from inside the structure. But beneath words, threading through like bloodstream poison, was something else, sound that bypassed ears entirely and spoke to primitive terror centers. "Do you hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" Webb replied, eyes wide with fear. "The voices," Yuki said quietly. "Old Japanese. Very old. They're asking for help." "From inside that thing?" Morrison pointed with shaking hand. "Not inside," Yuki corrected, face pale in harsh LED light. "From underneath. They're coming from below." That's when Sarah realized the structure wasn't sitting on the chamber floor, it was growing from it, erupting upward like impossible matter crystal. And beneath, far beneath, something stirred. Something vast and patient and utterly inhuman, waiting in Earth's deep places for visitors who could appreciate its true nature. The nightmare was awakening. Chapter 3. Voices from beneath grew stronger as they circled the impossible structure, creating human suffering chorus that seemed to emanate from rock itself. Yuki's translation became fragmented as ancient Japanese mixed with languages predating human civilization. "They're saying someone's coming," Yuki stammered. backing away. Someone who sleeps in deep places. They're begging for it to stay asleep. Morrison's instruments abandoned normal function. Display showed physics violations, negative temperatures alongside intense heat, impossible electromagnetic patterns, gravitational anomalies suggesting mass creation and destruction at molecular levels. "We need to leave," he said, voice cracking. "This place isn't meant for human minds." But turning to retreat, they discovered their first major problem. Their entrance was gone. The chamber stretched in all directions, a perfect circle with no visible exits. Their footprints led to blank stone wall showing no disturbance signs. "Impossible," Webb said, hands searching seamless rock. "We just came through here. There has to be a mechanism." Sarah studied the central structure, fighting induced vertigo. Up close, she saw its surface wasn't solid, but composed of millions of tiny openings, holes extending infinitely inward, creating depths her eyes couldn't process. From those holes, barely audible but strengthening, came movement sounds. "Something's coming up," she said. The first emergence was a hand. Human-shaped but wrong in every detail, fingers too long, joints bending impossibly, skin absorbing rather than reflecting light. The hand grasped a larger opening's edge, followed by an arm twisting like substantiated smoke. Then came the head. Sarah's mind recoiled, consciousness desperately trying to rationalize features that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Human enough for recognition, but alien enough to trigger every wrong instinct. The thing's eyes held intelligence, but intelligence filtered through eons of existence in spaces between spaces. Consciousness stretched and warped until bearing only faint terrestrial resemblance. "Taskete," it whispered in a voice like grinding stone. "Help us." More hands emerged from other openings, dozens, then hundreds, reaching upward with drowning swimmers' desperate motion. Accompanying voices created despair symphony resonating in Sarah's bones. Webb backed away, face slack with horror. "They're not trying to get out, they're trying to pull us in." Reaching hands began stretching toward them, extending impossibly far while maintaining beneath connections. The chamber filled with whispered pleading in languages both ancient and impossible. "The exit," Morrison shouted, pointing to wall section that hadn't existed moments before. "There. Can you see it?" Sarah saw only blank stone, but Yuki was already running toward it. As he approached, the wall shimmered, reality becoming negotiable at perception edges. He pressed hands against stone, and they sank through like water. "It's real," he called back. "But you have to believe it's real." One by one, they forced themselves through the phantom wall, each passage requiring faith that fought against their eyes' testimony. Sarah went last, and pressing through the impossible membrane, she felt something brush her ankle shadow and regret fingers trying to drag her back where geometry had no meaning. They emerged into a new passage carved from black glass. Walls reflected their light, creating multiple images of each person, reflections not quite matching movements. Sarah glimpsed herself from impossible angles, her reflections sometimes moving seconds early, sometimes lagging in temporal echoes that made her skin crawl. "Where are we?" Webb asked, voice echoing strangely. "Deeper," Morrison said, checking instruments again. Readings showed them several kilometers below sea level, where pressure should have crushed them instantly. "We're in space existing outside normal physics." The tunnel led downward, spiraling in patterns that hurt to contemplate. Descending, Sarah noticed their black glass reflections changing. Subtle at first, slight posture differences, expressions not matching her mood, but gradually, reflected figures began moving independently, turning to watch real people pass, faces showing others' emotions entirely. "Don't look at walls," Yuki warned. "Those aren't reflections anymore. They're things that live in mirrors, in spaces between what is and what could be." They passed through chambers filled with machinery, predating human civilization, impossible complexity devices running on beyond physics principles. Gears rotating through dimensions, pipes carrying substances neither quite liquid nor light, control panels with symbols rearranging when observed directly. In one chamber, they found Imperial Japanese Army team, remnants that sealed the caves in 1945. Soldiers sat in perfect formation around obsidian-carved table, uniforms pristine, faces frozen in absolute terror expression. But looking closer, Sarah realized they were still alive, eyes tracking movement, chest rising and falling with almost imperceptible respirations. One soldier turned his head with glacial slowness to look directly at her. His mouth opened, and after what felt like minutes, words emerged at geological time speed. "Run." "Why are you?" still can. They've been trapped 70 years, Yuki whispered, existing in slow time, aware, but unable to act. What did this to them? Webb asked. Their answer came from the chamber beyond, where passage opened into space so vast it might have been a pocket universe. Suspended in the center, surrounded by architecture folding through dimensions like space origami, hung the source of all wrongness they'd encountered. It was simultaneously organic and mechanical, beautiful and horrifying, ancient beyond comprehension yet somehow newly born. Crystallized thought tentacles connected it to surrounding structure, pulsing with energies that made reality flicker at edges. It was aware of them, Sarah realized with growing horror. It had been aware since they first entered the mountain. Everything they'd experienced, impossible geometry, time distortions, trapped soldiers, had been games played by consciousness so vast and alien that human sanity couldn't survive direct contact. And it was waking up. Chapter 4. The entity's attention fell upon them like physical weight, pressing against their minds with geological age's force. Sarah felt her consciousness stretching beyond comfortable human perception boundaries as something vast and alien examined her thoughts with casual thoroughness of a child dismantling toys. Welcome. It spoke without words, communication bypassing language entirely and imprinting meaning directly onto neural pathways. I've been dreaming of visitors for so very long. Webb collapsed first, blood streaming from his nose as his brain tried processing concepts human neurology simply wasn't equipped to handle. Morrison followed seconds later, instruments sparking and dying as electromagnetic pulses from the entity's awakening consciousness fried every circuit within 100 meters. Only Sarah and Yuki remained standing, though Sarah felt her sanity bleeding away like water through cupped hands. The entity's presence was overwhelming, not malevolent exactly, but utterly indifferent to human fragility the way mountains are indifferent to crawling insect. You are so beautifully limited, the entity continued, attention shifting between them like searchlights made of pure thought. Your perceptions constrained to such narrow spectrums, existence confined to such brief temporal spans. I had forgotten how charming mortality could be. What are you? Sarah managed to ask, though speaking required enormous effort against psychic pressure. Images flooded her mind, visions of the entity's origins spanning eons. She saw solar system births, continental drifts slow dance, species rise and fall that achieved interstellar travel before humanity learned firemaking. The entity was old, far older than Earth life, consciousness that emerged from quantum foam during universe youth and had been exploring spaces between dimensions ever since. I am a cartographer of impossibility, it explained. I map territories existing between what you call real and what you call dream. This mountain, this cave system, merely three-dimensional projections of my research station. Architecture around them began shifting and flowing, revealing true nature. What they'd taken for ancient stone was actually crystallized space-time, matter organized according to geometries, allowing multi-dimensional existence. The passages they'd navigated were neural pathways in a vast mind, and they'd been walking through the entity's manifest thoughts. Your species fascinates me, the entity continued. So young, yet already glimpsing mathematical structures underlying reality. You build thinking machines, split atoms, peer into quantum realms. In a few more millennia, you might be ready for contact. The soldiers, Yuki gasped, fighting to remain conscious under psychic onslaught. What did you do? They arrived during one of my deeper meditations. Rather than wake fully, I incorporated them into my dream state, a kindness really. Time moves differently in dreams. They've experienced only moments while decades passed in your linear reality. Sarah understood with growing horror what the entity suggested. It's going to do the same to us. We're going to become part of its eternal dream, trapped in slow time while the world above moves on without us. Not trapped, the entity corrected, having read her thoughts like text. Preserved, you will become part of something far greater than individual existence, contributing unique perspectives to my understanding of this dimensional region. The chamber around them began pulsing with rhythms matching no earthly heartbeat. Reality became increasingly negotiable as the entity's awakening consciousness exerted influence over local space-time. Sarah watched her own hand become translucent, phase partially from existence before snapping back to normal visibility. Webb and Morrison were changing too, their forms becoming less solid, more idealized, transforming into permanent residents of space where physical laws were suggestions rather than requirements. Their faces showed no pain, only dreamy contentment as consciousness began merging with something infinitely larger. Do not fear transformation, the entity soothed. Your essence will be preserved, memories cherished. You will help me understand what it means to exist in only 3 dimensions, to perceive time as river rather than ocean. But Sarah had noticed something the entity apparently had not. Her equipment pack, abandoned when Webb collapsed, still registered readings on Morrison's backup instruments. The electromagnetic anomalies weren't random, they followed a pattern, rhythm suggesting the entity's influence had limits. "Yuki," she whispered, hoping the entity was too focused on transformation to monitor their communication. "The spiral on the ceiling in the first chamber, you said your grandfather described it as sleeping God's eye?" "Yes," Yuki replied, his form beginning to waver at edges. "What if it's not an eye? What if it's a control mechanism?" Understanding dawned in Yuki's fading features, a way to put it back to sleep. "Clever little creatures," the entity commented, apparently having overheard. "But you misunderstand. I am not merely sleeping and waking, I exist across multiple consciousness states simultaneously. What you perceive as sleep is simply focus shift to other dimensional territories." Transformation was accelerating. Sarah could feel thoughts becoming fuzzy, memories being catalogued and filed in the entity's vast mental library. In moments, she would become another permanent resident of this impossible space, consciousness preserved like insects in amber. Unless she lunged for Morrison's equipment pack, grabbing the emergency flare gun they'd brought for helicopter signaling. The entity's attention shifted toward her with collapsing star weight, but she was already moving, running back toward the passage they'd entered through. "You cannot escape what you have already become," the entity observed with something like amusement. Transformation is irreversible once begun, but Sarah wasn't trying to escape. She was running toward the chamber with spiral ceiling, the one that hurt to look at directly. If Yuki's grandfather was right, if it really was some control mechanism, she burst into the circular chamber and aimed the flare gun at the spiral's center. The red flare struck moving obsidian and exploded in crimson light shower that revealed the spiral's true nature, not solid matter, but organized energy, a pattern somehow regulating the entity's influence over local reality. The flare's chemical light disrupted the pattern, introducing chaos into a system that had maintained perfect order for millennia. The spiral began flickering, its hypnotic motion stuttering like broken film reels. From far below came sound like the universe itself, sighing, the entity's consciousness recoiling as its control matrix destabilized. Transformation halted, then reversed, as the entity was forced to withdraw influence to prevent damage to its dimensional research station. "Fascinating," came the entity's voice, now distant and amused rather than overwhelming. "You have discovered the emergency reset I installed to prevent paradox cascades. How wonderfully inventive." Sarah felt her body solidifying, thoughts becoming her own again. The oppressive psychic weight lifted, replaced by something almost like respect from the vast intelligence below. "Very well, little cartographer. You have earned freedom through cleverness rather than force a solution I did not anticipate. You may return to your linear existence, though you will find the experience rather limiting after touching the infinite." Chamber walls began shifting, revealing the passage back to surface. But before they left, the entity had one final communication: "Tell your kind this place will remain sealed until they are ready for true contact. When your species has learned to think in 11 dimensions and can appreciate beauty existing across multiple temporal states, perhaps we will meet again under better circumstances." They fled upward through passages that rearranged themselves to speed their exit, carrying unconscious companions toward blessed natural sunlight normalcy. Behind them, the entity settled back into vast meditations, mapping territories between dimensions while waiting for humanity to evolve enough for meaningful conversation. But as they finally emerged into the forest clearing where Sato waited with the helicopter, Sarah knew some part of her would always remain in that impossible space below. She had touched something infinite and alien, and the memory would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The nightmare had been real, but they had survived it. For now,